Another All Blacks excursion to America is in the books, and it made me curious about New Zealand rugby's other sojourns stateside. While not frequent visitors, they are also no strangers to our shores, which is a bit odd in and of itself. If we're being completely honest here, America has a small but very passionate and very loyal rugby fan base. On the other hand, most Americans outside of that bubble would confuse Kiwis with Aussies.
Accents are completely different. They're like, "Where's the car?" And we're like, "Where's the car?"
Despite that, the All Blacks continue to bring in pretty good crowds, all things considered, when they do visit. The showing in San Diego against Fiji proves once again that USA does like its rugby, even if we aren't so good at it. Like playing Ireland in Chicago a few years back, I think it was very wise of New Zealand to play Fiji in San Diego. It was a good way to connect with the Fijian and larger Pacific Islander community on the West Coast, and of course, fans of rugby of all nationalities turned up, as they tend to do when the All Blacks visit the US. The All Blacks playing a game in California also keeps alive a tradition which is now centuries old, that of course being Kiwis doing America. I'm Cheyenne Hollis, this is the Touchback, and break out the fanny pack, or is it bum bag? I guess it all depends where you were born. Regardless, we are looking at all of the times New Zealand rugby has visited the US of A.
I can travel anywhere except Cuba, and I will travel to New Zealand.
We begin in 1906 with the original All Blacks, who were just on a grand world tour. Leaving New Zealand on July 30th, 1905, they basically played anyone in England, Ireland, Wales, or Scotland with a team from mid-September onward. Then, on New Year's Day, 1906, they squared off against France in the latter's first ever rugby union test match. According to author Christopher Tobin, the team was preparing to head back home when they were informed that the New Zealand Prime Minister at the time had organized a few extra fixtures for them in America. Organized is probably being a bit too generous in the description. Hastily thrown together would be a far more apt description of what these matchups would entail. The original All Blacks headed from Europe to New York by boat, and when they arrived, the locals didn't really have a team. In fact, the contest against a side from Brooklyn and New York was really nothing more than an intra-squad scrimmage. Not that it really mattered in the scheme of things. After doing a ton of sightseeing from sea to shining sea, the Kiwis arrived in San Francisco for a matchup against notable American foes, British Columbia? That's right, they played a team from Canada in the United States. It's okay though, 7 years later, and we here on the West Coast would get our money's worth when it came to New Zealand rugby. That brings us to the 1913 New Zealand tour of North America, which is such a weird time in history. In October and November, the All Blacks cruised up and down the Golden State playing various collegiate sides. Cal, Stanford, St. Mary's, Santa Clara, and USC to name a few. They even made it all the way to Reno for a game against Nevada. So what the hell is going on here? Well, around the time New Zealand rugby first visited California way back in 1906, a lot of colleges in the West, and specifically California, were switching from football to rugby due to concerns of the violence of the sport. That meant when the All Blacks came back to California in 1913, they were able to play a bunch of college teams. This tour also featured a test against the United States, the first time the All Blacks played the USA, and the team headed up to British Columbia to face off against a few sides from Canada. What they did not find on this tour was much in the way of competition. The Kiwis conceded only 6 points across 16 games, with no team even coming close to upsetting them. And who knows what exactly they made of 1913 Reno, which is still in the last vestiges of the wild, wild West. Anyway, British Columbia remained a regular stop for the All Blacks after this, although they would not return to the United States until 1954 as part of one of their circumnavigating the world tours. Their very last stop on that 1954 tour was San Francisco once more, where they faced off against the Cal Golden Bears and a team of California All-Stars. The college side didn't do half bad, losing 14-6. To put that into context, all of the American and Canadian teams in 1913 could only combine for 6 total points on that tour. Progress is progress, I suppose. Nearly 20 years would go by before New Zealand rugby would return, this time in 1972 as a one-off visit to New York. Here, a team of locals playing under the New York banner were blown out. Interestingly though, this fixture was played in Downing Stadium on Randall's Island. It's quite a unique facility that probably deserves its own video, but I digress. Thankfully, the United States would not have to wait decades for New Zealand to return once more. We were able to see the All Blacks, well, technically an All Blacks 15, as part of the 1980 New Zealand tour, which included a quick stop in North America and a real-life test match against the United States. It was not pretty. New Zealand absolutely boat raced the Eagles in a venue that was still a year away from being known as Jack Murphy Stadium. This, by the way, would be the highest attended rugby match on American soil until 2013. Also, a quick 20-second timeout. The announcers during the New Zealand-Fiji game in San Diego would not shut up about how this was the All Blacks' second appearance in San Diego. Look, I get mentioning it once or twice, but it felt like every 5 minutes they were being required by the broadcaster to talk about how New Zealand was playing their second game in San Diego. Moving on. The first game for the All Blacks in San Diego would be their last stateside for a few decades. Obviously, rugby union as a sport during the 1980s and 90s undergoes some pretty radical transformations that change just about everything. One thing to be phased out were the huge multi-month, multi-continent tours that covered vast swaths of the globe. Things would begin settling down in the aftermath of Y2K. New competitions and new ideas began happening, including the launch of the Churchill Cup. This is a competition I would love to see revived. I've always felt it was super underrated. It also allowed me to see international rugby for the very first time in Northern California. That showdown featured the Maori All Blacks, a team consisting of players with Maori ancestry. Not quite the A team, not quite the All Blacks, but a very good side representing New Zealand nonetheless. They showed up at Buckshaw Stadium in Santa Clara as part of the 2006 Churchill Cup, where they faced off against the USA and Ireland in pool play. As I said, it was really cool to see the Maori All Blacks play in Santa Clara. The Churchill Cup, though, well, it wouldn't be long for this world, eventually fading away by the turn of the decade. The Maori All Blacks would return 7 years later in 2013 as part of a tour of North America, this time visiting Philadelphia. Sorry, I can't do it. It's Chester, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia Union, my ass. They might as well be called the New Jersey Union. That stadium is far closer to Jersey than it is Philadelphia. Putting that aside, this was a great game between the USA Eagles and the Maori All Blacks in front of a sellout Chester, Pennsylvania crowd. The Maori All Blacks would return to American shores in both 2016 and 2018. The less said about that 2016 visit, the better. Seriously, playing anything in Toyota Park and calling it Chicago should be a crime. Meanwhile, the 2018 showdown against the USA Eagles was at Soldier Field, actual Chicago, and part of a triple header that also saw the American women face off against the New Zealand Black Fern and an Ireland-Italy test match. With the Maori All Blacks out of the way, let's return our attention to the senior side, and to do that we need to hop back in the calendar to 2014. So one of the reasons New Zealand began zeroing in on Chicago as a destination was because of a 2014 test match against the USA Eagles. The game itself sucked. It sucked ass, and a lot of it. That just happens to be the case anytime a game finishes with a scoreline of 74-6. The silver lining, though, was more than 60,000 people showed up to Soldier Field to watch New Zealand play the USA. 2 years later, and one day after the Maori All Blacks played America in Philadelphia, the top side played Ireland at Soldier Field again in another well-attended matchup as part of a larger rugby weekend in Chicago. There was a World Cup in 2019, and then the pandemic hit in 2020, which meant the All Blacks would not return to this part of the world until 2021. This time they opted to play at FedEx Field in Washington, D.C. The pre-match ceremonies honoring Sean Wainui were excellent, a very fitting tribute to a player who had passed away prematurely. The game itself was butt though, and we're just going to move on because I have zero desire to relive that. 3 years later, and this brings us to the match in San Diego against Fiji. It was a blowout, but a well-attended one. Fiji did have some moments. They will keep things interesting even in the most lopsided of score lines. While the game itself may have been nothing to write home about, I am guessing those in attendance still had a pretty good time. At the end of the day, New Zealand's history in America is absolutely fascinating to me. It may not be the longest book ever written, but man, there are some curious quirks in there. For starters, the team was never actually even supposed to come stateside. Their prime minister just happened to schedule games without the team knowing and said, guess what? You guys are going to America. Then they just happened to be in California at the time the state's colleges had switched from American football to rugby. This was such a weird blip in the collegiate athletics in the West Coast only, and just being there part of that, I think, is pretty damn cool. Then after a lull, the All Blacks showed up randomly in the 70s and 80s as rugby was kind of on the upswing in America. And then in recent times, they've been here to give fans they know are in America. Look at the attendances, look at how many people show up to watch All Blacks games in America in the 2000s. There is a demand to see this team play in the United States. Of course, the results have not always been pretty, at least on the field. But that is also part of the tradition of the All Blacks visiting America, just coming over here and running roughshod over whatever sides we put out against them. Frankly, I'm not sure what the future holds for New Zealand rugby, but I do hope they continue to drop in on the States every once in a while. These games are something fans have responded to, and whether those fans are Americans, expats, people coming from overseas. Look, I don't know what the crowd consists of in its entirety, but what I do know is when the All Blacks play in America, people are bound to turn up. Also, I think somewhat importantly here, America does have a place in All Blacks history. I mean, look, we're a relatively minor footnote, an insignificant blip, but it's still a blip nonetheless. I, for one, will never forget seeing those Maori All Blacks at Buckshaw Stadium of all places in the world. Finally, what Californians in the 1910s made of this huge group of Kiwi tourists playing rugby against local colleges is anyone's guess. Also, I have no proof of this, but I sure hope that those All Blacks did visit Southers Fort like every other tourist to Northern California is obligated to do. Thank you for watching this video. If you're interested in knowing more about how Major League Rugby hopes to make it big in America, video upper right hand corner of your screen, and to learn about Super Rugby's shrinking nature, video lower right hand corner. Until next time, I'm Shine Hollis, this is The Touchback, and as always, hashtag take it out to the 25.